For the House Ways and Means Committee, I find that due to the state of emergency declared by the governor as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in accordance with House Rule 67 and the governor's emergency order number 12 pursuant to Executive Order 2020-04, this public body is authorized to meet electronically. This is a revenue work session. Please note that there is no physical location for members of the public to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting. However, in accordance with the emergency order, I am confirming that all members of the committee and select legislative staff have the ability to communicate contemporaneously during this meeting through the Zoom electronic meeting platform, and the public has access to contemporaneously listen and, if necessary, participate in this meeting by the Zoom platform or by telephone. All necessary information has been made available in the House calendar and through the electronic calendar on the General Court website. The notices for this meeting complies with the House rules and RSA 91A. Anyone who has a problem accessing the meeting should call 271-3600 or email hcs@leg.state.nh.us. In the event the public is unable to access the meeting will be adjourned and rescheduled. I want to introduce the staff that are on the meeting assisting us. Jennifer Floor, researcher. Please note that all votes that are taken during this meeting should be done by roll call vote. Let's start the meeting by taking a roll call of attendance. When each member states their presence, please also state whether there is anyone in the room with you during this meeting, which is required under the right to know law. Representative Bernstein, you want to take the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to you, sir. Today is May 25th, 2021. It's 10 a.m. We'll begin roll call with Representative Abrami.
Here in my home in Stratham, and I'm alone.
Representative Griffin. Representative O'Leary.
Home, alone. Well, the wife is in the house someplace. Hudson.
Representative Ober.
Home in Hudson, the outside temperature is 80, the air conditioner is on.
And the cats are
Happy.
You still look like a cool cat there, Representative Ober. Representative Doucette.
Good morning. My home alone Salem.
Your clerk is Alan Burstein. I'm in my home office by myself in Nottingham, New Hampshire. Representative Bob Elliott.
Here in alone in Salem, New Hampshire.
Representative Janigian.
Here alone in my Salem, New Hampshire office.
Representative Nunes. Actually, Representative Nunes texted me saying he'll be in labor today. So I texted him back saying, I hope it's a boy.
Don't give up your day job, Alan.
Representative Baxter. Representative Spilsbury. Representative Tudor.
Here in the cellar in Northwood, wife and grandkids upstairs.
Representative Almy.
Here in Lebanon, alone.
Representative Ames.
I'm here in Jaffrey in my home office alone.
Representative Southworth.
Here in Dover, alone.
Representative Malloy. Represent the Honorable Representative Thomas C. Schomburg. Representative Tucker.
Home alone in Randolph.
Representative Gomarlo.
Home alone in Swansea.
Representative Loffman. Representative Gorg.
Good morning. I am present and alone.
Representative Hacken Phillips.
Good morning. I too am present and alone.
Representative Murphy.
Good morning. I am home alone in Hanover.
Chairman Representative Norman Major.
Good morning. I'm in my home in Plasto, and my wife is in the house, and hopefully the maintenance person will be here soon.
Mr. Chair, there are 17 members present, and my guess is the other 7 members are at the swimming hole.
Thank you, Representative Bernstein. And Janine, okay, you have and Melissa, Devin, and Carolyn. So before we get started, I had scheduled Thursday in case we need it, and we will not be meeting Thursday. The main reason is that Chris is tied up with the Senate, and he will be tied up with the Senate for a while. I asked if he would be available on Tuesday next week. Not being available there. Our next meeting on schedule for Tuesday, the 8th of June at 10 o'clock for revenues. So no meeting scheduled for next week. The next meeting is the 8th of June at 10 o'clock. The email that I sent out relative to the bills that are going to be passed at our session days next week was primarily in case those that are on the consent calendar are pulled off and somebody signs up. If they don't, nobody will be speaking. And then on those that are on the regular calendar, if there's nobody signed up in opposition, there'll be nobody speaking. All right. And then today we'll be hearing from the Department of Revenue, and they're primarily going over the revenues that they had worked with the Senate on. These will be the updated revenues. So everybody was sent a 10-page document last night. If you don't have it, it'll be coming up on the screen, and you can follow through with that. All right, so I'll turn this over to Carolyn, Melissa, and Devin. So Carolyn or Melissa or Devin.
You're muted. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Melissa Rollins, Senior Financial Analyst for the Department of Revenue. And with me for some support is Carolyn Lear, Assistant Commissioner. Would you mind if I shared my screen to show the presentation that you had just mentioned?
That would be super.
Okay, perfect. 1 second.
Janine, should be able to do that, right? Yep. Good, you have.
Okay, so everyone can see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, welcome. So yes, Representative Major, as you had said, today we are going to speak about revenue estimates that we have updated. We did this presentation to Senate Ways and Means May 10th and had worked with them as they just finalized their revenue estimates, which are at the end of our presentation for comparison purposes. The layout is very similar to what you have seen in the past. We will go through all our major taxes and show you the adjustments compared to plan, as well as letting you know that this data is through April as we are wrapping up May now, but I can speak to May some. And to let you know that we did take into account, obviously, the possible changes in recovery effects of COVID-19. So below is the chart that you're typically used of seeing. We have our DRA taxes, we have plan for fiscal year 21, we have the anomalous receivable that we've spoke about several times, so I won't go over that. If you have questions, feel free to ask, but I think you're pretty familiar with that. We have our low and high, which is net of that anomalous receivable, which is again consistent with how we've done it in the past. And then we have two columns. We have our low compared to plan and our high compared to plan. I do want to note a couple of the taxes have not changed since we were back here a month ago. I think it was April 28th. That's meals and rentals, CST, and revenue, real estate transfer tax. Those taxes performed as we had expected, so we did not update our estimates for the year. I also want to note that our growth ranges also have not changed for the taxes. We hadn't had any additional information since April 28th to make any modifications to those. And lastly, as you're familiar with, I did want to note that as you can see in our revenue estimates on the far right-hand side, COVID has affected taxes very differently. We do know some taxes have been performing very well, like business taxes and tobacco taxes, where M&R has been hit the hardest. But if you've been following either Chris Shea's revenue updates or the revenue updates that Devin sends out, you can see that M&R actually has done quite well this month. Okay, moving on to business taxes. I think when we came April 29th or April 28th last month, we hadn't updated these yet. We wanted to see how April had performed before we made estimates for the remaining months for fiscal year 21. So I'm sure you have looked at the information and have seen that April was a really healthy month. Business taxes for the month of April were 47.5% or 73.8 million ahead of plan. And that was our largest April looking back the last 10 years. Fiscal year to date, we're 174.5 million or 27.5% ahead of plan. That does include that $18.3 million anomalous receivable. And then we're 252 or 45.4 ahead of prior year. As we know, this pandemic, it's had different impacts on businesses, with some hurting while others were thriving. Based on the revenue, it does look like business activity for April performed much better than we anticipated, as well as I believe businesses anticipated. And I say that because we do know some businesses definitely struggled and suffered through the pandemic. However, it appears that the majority of New Hampshire business taxpayers did fare better than they had expected. And this is shown in part again to April being up that 73.8 million, meaning, and it was driven by the extension payments, meaning that taxpayers didn't adjust their estimate payments through the year. And then when they had to true up their payment come March and April, they ended up paying a lot more than they had anticipated paying. And we think this can be in part with businesses and individuals receiving more money from the state and federally than they expected. We've had lots of talks about it, and we know that this was the largest stimulus package the federal government has ever infused in the economy, with being a little bit less than 25% of GDP. And then this coupled with consumers having more money, spending more money to spend, and a shift in the economy had businesses reporting higher profits than we could have anticipated. So because of how March and April came, we revised our revenue estimates and used a different modeling approach. What we did was look at historic performance for revenue for May and June, and how that was based on March and April's performance. So we modeled our low estimate for fiscal year 21, 947.5 million, was based on the low historical performance of May and June based on March and April. And then our high revenue was 964.9 million, and that was modeled as the average historic performance of revenue for May and June based on March and April. And then for our fiscal year 22 and 23 growth rates, you should be familiar with these at this point. We have a 2 to 6% based on predicted GDP for fiscal year 22. And then for fiscal year 23, we have a 3 to 5% growth rate based on GDP as well.
Well, Melissa, you didn't change the growth rates. And so these are based upon the growth rates that you would have seen 6 months ago.
We adjusted these, I think, a couple months back.
Okay, all right. So it's soon enough.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Happy to answer any questions on business taxes.
Representative Bromley, followed by Representative Elmy. And Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Melissa. So I just want to make sure I understand. So you didn't adjust 21. 21 is what it is, even though we know some of that money that's come in may have to be given back next year, correct?
Right. So just to inform the committee, the way the revenue estimates work is it's based on current law. And if there are any dollars going back based on bills, for instance, like SB3, those come out in the surplus statement item. So we don't adjust for those revenues coming out of the taxes. Again, it's based on base, and then Chris will do up the surplus statement to get the net revenue.
Okay, yes, that's what I assume what we're gonna do, is that we'll do our, but this is the base, even though we know the base is kind of, could be potentially higher than it should be, but that's the only way we can show it. And then it's really up to us to determine how much anomalous revenue in the next 2 years, that we show in the surplus statement as a negative, correct? Is that what we're gonna do?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Almy.
And I had the same kind of question. I mean, this is really anomalous, this revenue increase, but I guess we can't treat it as anomalous until we've passed SB3. That's the first time we run into this problem.
Representative Yurley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Melissa, if I could inquire now, your low range and high range 2 to 6, does that take into effect the likely increase in federal taxes that are being considered at least? Or is that just strictly keeping things the way they are?
So this is keeping things the way they are. However, and Carolyn, jump in here if I'm incorrect in speaking, but I do know that if federal taxes are increased, I don't think that should affect our revenue, as it doesn't affect the base of taxpayers. I think it only affects our revenue if the base is changed.
Even though they would be spending more money off the top and having less money for us. Okay, yeah, that would come up in another area. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Representative Ames.
Thank you. Yeah, I had the same, I'm puzzling over the same question that Representative Abrami and Representative Alamy put to the fore. And it seems you've built, DRA has built its estimate for next fiscal year and the fiscal year after that on this fiscal year 21's performance, as I understand it, less without the anomalies that we've been talking about in the past. With SB3, assuming that passes, there'll be a surplus statement that says that it will cost us, presumably you'd use your timing methodology, somewhere in the neighborhood of $45 or $50 million, which suggests that in these figures that are for FY21, there's an anomalous amount that shouldn't be part of the growth projection. And could you speak to that?
Sure, I will take a stab at that question. So I think there's two different issues here. We have SB3, right, that will be coming out on the surplus statement. And then we just have PPP loans in general and what they produce for revenue. So I think those are two separate items. So SB3 is revenue, the 99.4 million spread out over the years is coming out because the PPP is not included in the gross income, and then they still get the deduction. So they're essentially getting those extra funds back, or those extra funds as a deduction against non-PPP. So that revenue is accounted for in the surplus statement. However, if we were just at current law without SB3 in, I don't think we think PPP would increase revenue a tremendous amount, because as Carolyn has spoke to, that if PPP is in their income, and then if they use that PPP as a deductible expense, which we assume most of them will, there is not a large revenue impact of the PPP funds.
Okay. Thank you.
Before we go to Representative Almy, there's one thing that nobody's mentioned yet. Besides the PPP, there's in these revenues that we're seeing now that are higher than what was predicted as a result of the other type of stimuluses that have been going on. And we haven't been able to identify those yet, but it has caused some of this excess revenue. And that isn't, and once the pandemic is over, that isn't going to continue.
Point.
So we need to be able to, if not now, define how much of that extra revenue is associated with those other types of stimulus packages. Have you done any of that yet, Melissa?
So I think as Carolyn has spoke to, and we've spoke to a couple of times, the challenge is that when we get returns, I mean, first off, we know the issue is that there's been an increase in extensions. So we don't have the data there. Second, the data that does come in, the money flows onto one line of the return, and it doesn't break out where those funds have come from. So it's near impossible for us to say what has increased those funds and if those trends will continue over the years. This has been a very dynamic economy where businesses have shifted and really has a lot of them have done well during this pandemic with the help of these stimulus funds. And maybe that bolstered their business enough. It's hard to say whether that is going to be one time and then you're going to see a drop, or if these funds have bolstered their business enough and made improvements that these revenues will continue. It's definitely an area that could use some discussion. I don't think we have the data or information to say where that has fallen, except looking at GDP, and it doesn't look like that's predicted to decline. So they're expecting the economy to continue to grow.
Right, and the GDP, latest information I heard for 2021 is supposed to come out to be in the 6% range, I believe. And so that GDP, it would be nice if it could stay at 6%, but I doubt it. Representative Almy, followed by Representative Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's this is going to be really difficult, but on the first thing I wanted to ask was on after we pass SB 3, on when we do another revenue estimate after that, wouldn't the revenue that we can identify, which I guess isn't going to be at least until after October, that is due to SB 3, be treated as anomalous for growth in the future years? And even though it's in the surplus statement for the budget, and the other thing, talking about the continued stimulus that is going on, a lot of it is supposed to be directed towards infrastructure kinds of things, capital investment, but also they fashioned that bill trying to help what they think of as smaller businesses. And that's another problem. For us, those are probably the large businesses, the top ones. To the extent that they send that stimulus more to small, real businesses we call small or medium, we haven't been getting very much revenue out of them. I don't know if that's going to reduce the amount of revenue we get or if they're going to thrive, which would be nice. But this whole thing is murkier than I have ever seen.
Your response, Melissa?
Sure. I tend to agree with you, Representative Almy. It is murky for sure. Obviously, I've said it before, we haven't been through anything like this. So modeling it out and trying to see what's going to happen is an evolution for sure. To go back to your original question about SB3 and when that passes in revenues. So I can just give you some information on how plan is built. So when plan is built, it's based on the revenues that is agreed upon. The final revenues are done, and then a surplus statement is subtracted out of those base revenues. And that would be the same for fiscal year 22 and 23. So essentially revenue estimates base, which are agreed upon and finalized, and then subtracting out what's in the surplus statement. So SB3 would be on that surplus statement for 22 and 23, and that would be plan, if that helps.
Representative Romney.
I'm going to beat this to death here a bit. So for us to try to figure out, we may need to do an adjustment to the base year revenues just on paper as we project 22 and 23. And to me, it's not the full 99.4 million. It's something less than that, that was, I would consider anomalous because they paid, taxpayers paid, hoping SB3 would pass, but knowing that they were going to get refunds. So, do we have an idea of what percent? I think we've asked this, we had this discussion before. Do we know, or a good guess at what percentage of the 99.4 million came in that we're going to give back came in March and April as people were filing their taxes?
So we have looked at it, and I want to again separate out SB3 and just say what percentage of revenue came in for taxpayers who paid or filed a Schedule 4, which is where the PPP data is reported on. And that was about 5.4 million that came in March and April. So again, those taxpayers that actually physically filed the return and had the schedules that reported the PPP data.
So their loans were forgiven and all that, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. I'm sorry, keep on going, Melissa. I interrupted.
And again, I'm going to have, Carolyn has been the SB3 expert. I'll speak to it, but if I say anything, she could feel free to jump in and correct. Again, I think that 99 million is, how do I want to term it? It's funds that would not have come in through the revenue. Some portion of that for the taxpayers, that's profits, that their profit exceeded their deduction, would be paying revenue. But I think we believe for the majority of taxpayers in the PPP area, if their loan was forgiven for PPP and they had expenses, if they expensed it out, there would be no tax revenue impact. The reason there was a revenue impact for SB3 is because you no longer have that PPP data in the income line, and you have extra expenses now to offset revenue without that PPP. So it's a added benefit as to why there's a revenue expense of the 99.4 million because of that added benefit of the SB3 or the PPP not being included in the income.
Okay. Like others have said, this gets more confusing as we talk, so it's okay. I think we'll come up with something, I'm sure.
Any further questions before Melissa goes on? Okay, Melissa.
Okay, so moving on to meals and rentals tax, as I stated in the beginning, we haven't updated our projections for meals and rentals tax because it has fallen in line the last couple of months of how we anticipated. Fiscal year to date, we are 64.9 million or 19.8% below plan. That's through April, or 35.5 million or 11.9% below prior year. We do know, if those of you have been following the report, that M&R so far is 2.9% below plan, which is a pretty big increase. And we know this based partly of things opening back up, more people being vaccinated, higher consumer confidence, and then just as this recovery rate continues to perform as we enter these warm months. I would suggest on meals and rentals tax, when you're doing your revenue estimates, we do have this range of 315.4 million as our low and 320.4 million as our high, to probably lean towards the higher end, as May came in towards our higher end of revenue estimates. And I don't think that's going to fall backwards. So I think the 315.4 is probably low at this point, and would recommend you guys going towards our higher end. Our higher end assumes a faster improvement. And that's exactly what we've seen this month. And then for fiscal year 22 and 23, we have the 5 to 10% growth, which is equal to 2018 revenues, and the high is equal to 2019 revenues, sort of getting us back to the normal range. And then fiscal year 23 is 4 to 6%, which is back to the historical growth that we've seen in the past for M&R. Any questions on meals and rentals tax?
Questions? Representative Southworth.
Thank you. This has been an area I've been thinking about for quite a while. And just 2 anecdotes, I just want to see if they fit in. My local everyday restaurant put 10 tables outside, but now the outside tables are full, and they're full inside, and they hired 2 new wait people. Also a gourmet restaurant that was very hard to get into and was losing funds, started letting people do 10 parties could do gourmet takeout at 2 o'clock, and they would stagger those. Now they're fully open inside. They're still doing the 10 party takeout. And again, they're doing better than ever, even though they're having to make up for the past. So that's just a couple examples in my area.
Yeah, I think that probably falls in line with why the growth grew so much this month.
Vaccination. Any further questions on meals and rooms? Okay, Melissa.
All right, tobacco tax. We did revise this tax. Tobacco tax fiscal year to date, we're 40.4 million or 24.4% ahead of plan, and 34.3 or 20% ahead of prior year. As we've talked about quite a bit, the Massachusetts ban on mentholated tobacco and other flavored tobacco products has continued to drive this increase in revenues, and other states have also seen that trend. What we are keeping an eye on for future tax years is there has been the FDA has been speaking about a proposed national ban on flavored tobacco products. So just something to keep in mind. There's no updated information as of yet. I think that came out at the end of April.
Can I ask a question right now? Is that, do you know how much of this revenue is due to the methanol cigarettes?
So we don't have a breakdown of that. It's not reported on our return. So it would be pretty difficult for us to say what the impact would be if there is a ban on flavored tobacco products. However, we do know that the increase is driven by those mentholated tobacco products. Anecdotally, we had reached out to wholesalers and retailers in the border states, and they had confirmed that they had seen quite dramatic increase in mentholated and flavored tobacco products. But we don't have a breakdown on that in our return data.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want Representative Burstein, or do you want me to keep going?
Representative Bernstein has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for taking my question, Melissa. There was some legislation in the Mass House about repealing the prohibition on menthol cigarettes or menthol products. Do you have any idea where that legislation stands now? Did that get defeated, or And I guess that's not just to you, but anyone who has any knowledge on it.
Sure, I did see that, and we do get regular updates on legislative information for tobacco. I don't think last I knew it was going to pass. I don't think it had very strong legs, but I don't have an update. We can look into that if you'd like, just to confirm that it hasn't had any gain traction since I last saw information on it.
Thank you.
That would be good if you looked into that. Thanks. Anybody else questions on tobacco at this point? Go ahead, Melissa.
Okay, so our low is 245.6 million. This assumes the increase due to Massachusetts flavor ban continues at the consistent rate. And then our high is 248.3 million. And this assumes the fiscal year to date over plan of 24% is maintained for the rest of the year, as well as an increase with the cross-border sales due to consumer confidence again and travel restrictions lifted. And then for fiscal year 22, we have negative 3% to 0%. This is the historic year-over-year reduction. And then we tempered it to account for any residual offsetting of e-cigarettes. And then fiscal year 23, we have a negative 4% to negative 1%. And again, that's just consistent with tobacco tax trends in the past after we sort of had this year of this blip year of the e-cigarettes and the Massachusetts tobacco mentholated flavor ban. Happy to answer questions on tobacco tax.
Representative Alme.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is minus 3% enough if they ban flavored tobacco, if they take the ban off of flavored tobacco products in Massachusetts or nationally?
Can you ask that one more time? Do you mean if they put the ban on in Massachusetts?
Oh yeah, if they put it on, right, sorry.
That's okay.
Too many negatives in my thought.
Yeah, that's okay. So we have not accounted for the national ban on flavored tobacco products because we don't know if it's going through at this point. I did read that if it were to go through, it would take a year. So I assume we'd see it more in 23 than 22, but it's not factored into our estimates at this point.
Any further questions? Go ahead, Melissa.
All right, moving on to interest and dividends tax. I think when we were here a month ago, we didn't have an estimate on this tax because we were waiting for April to come in. Fiscal year to date, we are 13.5 million or 13.8% ahead of plan. This includes the 9.2 million of anomalous receivable, and we're 33.8 or 43.7 ahead of prior year. As we know, this tax does have historic year-over-year swings and does seem to do well when the stock market performs well, which is shaky a little here and there right now. But we do know people have had more money in the bank during this pandemic. Lastly, I wanted to note that the IRS did extend the due date for individuals to pay returns to May 17th, although New Hampshire maintained their April 15th due date. So in April, we did see some reductions in revenues, and we assumed it was because of the federal due date. As we talk about the anomalous receivable, that happened when taxpayers did that last year, when the feds put the due date out to July and we said June, taxpayers still filed late. So looking at May numbers so far, they have come in ahead of plan. And that is because taxpayers filed late. They were supposed to file it in April and they filed in May based on the federal due date. We did factor that into our revenue estimates. So fiscal year 21, our low range is 124 million. This assumes fiscal year to date percentage over plan of 14% is maintained through the end of the year, with revenue shifting again from April to May. And then our high is 132 million. This again assumes revenue shifted from April to May, with increased tax reported on returns and extensions for tax year 20 compared to 2019 and 2021, estimates continuing on trend. It looks like right now, based on our estimates, we still have June to come in, which is another estimate month, but we're falling pretty close to the middle of our range right now for interest and dividends tax for fiscal year 21. And then fiscal year 22, we have the 4 to 6% growth based on past performance of the tax coupled with anticipated GDP. And then in 23, we have this tax slowing down to a 2 to 4% growth, again, based on past performance and then an anticipated reduction of GDP in 2023.
Questions on interest and dividend? Once more, any questions on interest and dividend tax? Representative Southwood.
Yes. Basically, this would be deducted in the surplus statement if various bills pass.
That's accurate.
So it would be, a net zero, really.
What would be a net zero?
Well, if it goes in the revenue and comes out in the surplus statement. If it's phased out quickly, and we don't know how that's going to work, but.
Yeah, so I think the phase out, the larger impact is in later years. It's a longer phase out for this tax. So I think there's sort of a minimal decrease that will occur on the surplus statement for 22 and 23. And then the further you go out, the larger the decrease will be in revenues.
So pardon my ignorance. So really they have decided that they're going to do the phase out?
I think it's still up for discussion. It's over with the Senate right now.
Representative Janine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure you're going to know the answer to this, Melissa, but I guess one of the things I'm concerned about is we've heard that the Biden administration is considering doubling the capital gains tax so that instead of the high range of 20, it'll be potentially a high range of 40, plus the Obama tax of 3.4%, yielding a total capital gains of roughly, I believe, I think it's 43.4 or something like that. Do we have any historical data on how the state's interest in dividends tax received could be influenced by the federal? I know the federal's been the same for quite some time, so that's why I'm wondering whether you have any idea how that could influence, because that's going to be a huge change in the federal, which could cause people to not sell stocks and other things and maybe wait for it to change.
We have not done any comparison from the interest and dividends tax to the federal tax. Carolyn, do you have any more information on how you think that would affect interest and dividends tax?
No, I don't have any other information, but I do think it's an apt point, right? I mean, the tax rate certainly could impact taxpayer behavior and therefore impact our tax. Of course, the IND tax doesn't tax capital gains. It taxes the income earned on holding stock. So if the federal tax rate encourages taxpayers to hold on to their stock longer rather than sell it, presumably you could see an impact on the IND tax, which I'm presuming would be a positive impact. But I don't know that we've certainly not looked at it before, and I would have to think long and hard about whether we could do any predictive work to try to estimate that impact.
Thank
you. Representative Ames.
Yeah, I just thank you. I believe that capital gains tax proposal is related only to taxpayers with very high incomes. In other words, there's a different threshold that's part of the package. So just take that into account. And then, of course, the other point is that as far as individuals are concerned, we don't tax capital gains, and perhaps the buying and selling of stock would be triggered by the federal action, but as I say, it's limited to some individuals who have other ways of making their money. And so I'm not so sure that would be the case. Thank you.
Further questions or comments on the interest and dividend tax? Okay, Melissa, you can continue.
Okay. Moving on to CST, or the Communication Services Tax. This is again a tax that we have not felt the need to update since we last presented to you because it had performed as we anticipated. Fiscal year to date through April, we're 100 million or 0.3% below plan, so basically at plan, and 400,000 or 1.2% ahead of prior year. This tax can be affected by the New Hampshire unemployment rate, taxability of video conferencing, and the increased use of product, as well as decreased use of VoIP. So as I said, our estimate has remained the same at 39.1 million. This is a loss of 2% for the remaining months of the year. And then we keep this tax flat for 22 and 23. It's a pretty consistent tax month over month, year over year.
Can you speak more to the taxability of the video conferencing?
Sure. So I think we're still at the same point that we discussed a month ago. If that's what you're referring to, when we say taxability of video conferencing, we're talking about some applications like we're using today. Those are taxable under the communication services tax and obviously have been in higher demand and higher use since the pandemic. Our audit division is working on making sure taxpayers are paying taxes for these platforms that are taxable. And hopefully we'll make sure everyone's in compliance.
Have you seen much evidence of a number of clients not in compliance on this video conferencing tax?
I think, again, it's a little bit too early to know that. Audit is doing a project on it. So they will eventually have more information if they can share it based on the number of taxpayers. But when they file the return, it's not broken out onto what area is being taxed. It's just a number as a whole. So it takes some digging to see if they are charging tax on it.
Well, that's a statement that comes up all the time, doesn't it?
Sure does.
Representative Ames, you still have your hand up?
No, I'm sorry.
Any further questions on the communication services tax? Okay, Melissa.
Okay, real estate transfer tax. Again, this is a tax we did not update our estimate from when we were last here because it had performed as we expected in April and in May. I think we're starting to figure out a little bit, which is nice. Fiscal year to date, we through April were 37 million or 28.2% ahead of plan and 30.2 million or 21.9% ahead of prior year. As we've stated several times, fiscal year to date amounts are net of a $5 million transfer to the Affordable Housing Fund. It's new this year, so when you're comparing it to prior year, you should add back that $5 million to get sort of an apples to apples comparison. With real estate transfer tax, it's important to look at mortgage interest rates and how they're performing. They have been at a historical low. We do know that they've bumped up in the last month or so, not by a ton, but something definitely keeping an eye on. Other factors are virtual home sales and available housing and property value, as well as inventory shortage, cost of building supplies, and a lower affordability factor. So we know all of these really make this tax go up and down. So we know that home prices have gone through the roof, especially with available housing being low. People are paying much more for homes and actually paying cash for homes than they had in the past. However, what we do keep an eye on is that affordability factor, because if you have high home prices and low interest rates, you can afford more. But if those interest rates start to go up and home prices keep going up, what someone can afford definitely decreases. And that can affect the amount of transactions that occur. So for fiscal year 21, we have a range of 201.5 million. This assumes the fiscal year to date percentage over plan of 28% is maintained through the end of the year. And our high is 205.7 million. And this assumes the fiscal year to date percentage over plan increases to 30%. For fiscal year 22, we have a low of -7% and a high of -2%. The -7% assumes that the fiscal year is going to continue strong, and then it's slowly going to taper off to performance less than we saw in 2021. And that's for the -7 to -2%. And then fiscal year 23, we have a range of -10% to -8%. Again, we assume historical trends were maintained for fiscal year 2020 through 2022. So essentially removing this peak that we have seen with real estate transfer tax and the spike in the housing market. And that does fall in line with economist predictions that 2023 will start to have a lower decline compared to 22 for the real estate transfer market. Happy to answer any questions.
Representative Janine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering, when you estimate your ranges, do you take potential inflation into account, as there is a concern that inflation may increase in the coming years? Is inflation part of, I guess, is the inflation factor a part of the range?
We have not specifically looked at inflation and applying it to our estimate ranges.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? So the FY23 is more so that the housing bubble is coming down because the interest rates are going up, less houses are sold, and prices are probably going down because of that. Is that the main contributor there?
Yeah, the way we modeled out fiscal year 23 is we took 21 out of the picture. So where would we be if we started with 20 and if we continued to grow? Because real estate transfer has a pretty standard growth rate over the last couple of years. So if you took that standard growth rate from fiscal year 20 and grew it to fiscal year 23, what would that look like? And that brought us to that -10 to -8%, because we don't think that the market will maintain where it has been with the 2021 spike up, with all the factors that have come in with, again, the real estate market being really hot, interest rates being really low. And what has happened is, I'm sure you've all read in the news, is that the inventory shortages have shrunk, as well as cost of building supplies and getting people to build homes has also reduced. So that inventory is starting to fall at historical lows. So at some point, we think it's going to catch up and not have enough housing available, which would decrease the home prices, as well as decrease the transaction amounts and get us back to the normal.
Any further questions? Representative Bromley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Listen, this is a random thought I had here as you're talking. You know, we all look at that revenue focus at the end of every month. That's put out by Administrative Services. Who puts that out? Administrative Services.
Yep.
But I think do you guys provide input into how to spread the revenues, especially in a year that may be different than past years, like this tax, for instance, may have a different pattern of, because you were saying, if by the second half of the year, the number of transactions will be less than the first half of the year, which may be different than the historic trends. So do you get to say your piece? Does Department of Revenue get to work with them to come up with a way to spread the estimates across the 12 months?
Yeah, great question, Representative Bromley. We sure do. So essentially, DAS sends us our revenues and asks us to spread them out over the 12 months. And we do look at information like that. We look at historical trends. We look at how it performed the prior year. We remove any anomalies that we know occurred in different months that may spike up a percentage of revenue in a specific month. And then we may also make adjustments to situations like this where we may see a spike up in the first 6 months and then a decrease in the next 6 months. And then we submit that to DAS for approval.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. That's great.
Any further questions? All right, Melissa.
All right, I believe this is our last tax, utility property tax. We did adjust this down some. Fiscal year to date through April, we're down 2.6 million or 7.8% below plan and 1.8 million or 5.6 below prior year. We did want to note that in April, we did see a decline in revenue compared to prior year and plan, and this was essentially due to some credits on file and due to decreased valuations compared to prior years. So we have the next month being down 10%, and that is because valuations that came in January were down 10% compared to the prior year. And just a little bit of information for those of you that are not familiar how UPT works. Essentially, taxpayers make quarterly estimate payments based on their last valuation, and then in January, they true up those payments compared to their new assessment value. So if their assessment value went more, they end up with more funds on file, which essentially creates a credit, and then they use those up pretty quick, and that's what we saw in April, some utilization of those credits. Other factors to consider with this tax is some properties may decline in value due to changes in economic conditions, or may sometimes get adjusted if there's new taxable property that may be constructed. And it does appear that UPT was not impacted by the COVID-19 economic crisis. With that information, fiscal year 21, our new number is 40.6 million. And then again, we have the tax slat for 22 and 23.
Questions on the utility property tax? Okay, Melissa, continue.
Okay, and then lastly, we have our revised revenue estimates. This is sort of just a one-page cheat sheet with fiscal year 21 having the anomalous receivable removed, and it just sums up all our highs and lows high and low ranges for 22 and 23. And then lastly, we have our colorful comparison sheet. On the left, we have our fiscal year 20 audited revenue for reference. We have fiscal year 21 plan. We then have the governor's and your estimates, which had pre-March data. We have those filled in, and then we have Senate's newest estimates that were done on Monday. That includes April data, and it has our high and low that we just went over. And then we have this for 22 and 23. We always like to note on this chart, it's more important to pay attention to the percentages growth for our low and high versus the actual number, because those percentages growth vary based on what your base is for fiscal year 21. And then same with 23. Focus on the percentages because it depends on what your base is for 2022.
This is a great chart. Glad you include this.
Thanks.
The wealth of information here. Questions? Representative Alman. You're muted, Susan.
Melissa, you're going to send this to us, aren't you? And I think it sounds like Chris is out of business at the moment, out of our business.
This was sent to you last night by Jen. Jen sent it.
Yeah, it came in last night.
We all got it.
If you didn't get it, I'll send you mine.
Thanks. I'm trying to.
In the meantime, further questions from the committee members on any of the presentation that Melissa went through? Carol, do you have anything to add, or Devin?
I don't think so. I think Melissa did a great job.
I think so too. I know so. It's a great team with the DRA right now.
Found it.
Devin, do you have anything to add? Okay. All right. Representative Bromley.
Since we're going to do our actual revenue estimates on June 8th, we'll have May data, which would probably be helpful. I guess I would just ask the Department of Revenue not to redo what they did, but if there's anything they see when May is finalized that they think is noteworthy, that just pass it along to us before, as we do our January, was it 8th you said, Norm? January 8th, not January, June 8th. Work.
Yes, I'm sure we'll be with you on June 8th, at least in the audience, and we'll be happy to share any new or helpful information that we have based on how May performs.
On June 8th, we'll have both the LBA and the DRA. The LBA could not be with us today, or will not be available next week because they're finishing up the budget with the Senate. So that's why I pushed this out to the 8th. Representative Alamy, followed by Representative Southworth.
So I just went on, spent the time, I should have been looking at my email again, on going through all of the latest May data. And I think that the DRA has just given us just everything that that you could consider had changed so far. And we're pretty close to the end of May at this point. But I do agree that if there's another few surprises, we ought to know about it. Thanks.
Representative Southworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A point of order, it seems obvious, I guess, but they'll be taking our revenue estimates, subtracting the surplus statement if most of it is negative, then that will give new figures that hopefully would match the Finance Committee's budget. I just haven't seen a chart before that showed the surplus statement subtracted that way. I bring it up because I'm still finding many of my constituents are reading on the paper about the great revenues, and they aren't really understanding the impact of the surplus statement.
And that's why they elected you as their state representative, so you could inform them.
Yes, I've been trying.
Okay, any other comments from any of the committee members? Then what we will do on the 8th, we'll have the DRA and along with the LBA. We'll also have the final numbers from the Senate on their budget with their surplus statement. So we'll be able to have that as a comparison. And then we'll consider all of this on the 8th. Any further questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman?
Hold on a second.
Do you want him to get your email?
Yeah, just wait a couple minutes. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, shouldn't we take a look at the Department of Safety estimates for the Highway Fund? I think that they had estimated it somewhat rosier, but I haven't been able to find their month to month on estimates of what the road toll was going to come in at. But as I recall them, they thought that we'd be closer than we are now to 2019. We are, the latest week came down to -3%.
Yeah.
But 2 weeks before that, it was still at -10.
We're going to bring in all the other agency heads and review their revenues and see what's changed and if we need to make any changes. And
Is that on the 8th?
that may happen on the 9th.
Thank you.
Anything else? If not, I'm going to have to drop off. There's nothing else, and we thank everybody for attending this morning.
Thank you.
And thanks to the DRA for another excellent job.
I second that.
It was interesting information.
And no meeting tomorrow, Mr. Chairman, correct?
Correct. No meeting tomorrow.
We'll see you in Bedford.